And welcome back. We have previously discussed how to make artwork and various animations using pixel art. But now we are going to take a lot of those same skills that we first used and apply them into more of a 2D animation sense. And in order to do that, we actually need to switch to a different app to be able to create those corresponding animations. The app that we're going to use for that is Adobe Animate. So before we get too crazy and start making a bunch of different animations, we're first going to take a look at Adobe Animate and a couple of different things that you're going to need to know as we move into using this app. The first thing here, of course, is we are at the loading screen. So we need to create a new animation. And one thing you will notice here when you're using Adobe Animate is you have a bunch of different options here when you have this screen. So for example, character animation, which is where we're going to do most of our work, is the first option. You can see there's also things such as social, which is referring more to things like social media, as you can see by the Facebook and Twitter logos. Games, which are more for game-based, with such as web or even mobile. Education. You have ads, which are typically things like banner ads that you'll put into a web page. Of course, more web-based there. And of course, you even have some advanced things here for things that we're going to be well beyond the scope of what we're going to do in this class. For our purpose, we're going to stick here with character animation. Now, the next thing you need to look at is the size of your animation. You can do a custom size animation just by setting a width and height. That is still perfectly viable. But a lot of times we're going to be working in one of these presets here. And starting off, we have, of course, the HD preset, which is 720p. We have full HD and 4K. Now, because we are going to start something pretty simple, we, of course, can start with a standard as well because it will give us a smaller workspace to start with. But let's go ahead and, just for today's purpose, go ahead and just leave it on the regular HD. And over here, this is very important, is setting our frame rate. How many frames are you going to control? So we did see this a little bit when we worked in with Photoshop. However, the ability to control things like frames per second is a lot easier to do here in Animate because it's going to be something that's much more important. Additionally, the platform type is two options. We have ActionScript 3 or HTML5 canvas. And where this is going to come into play is what kind of document are you making? And for our purpose, we're going to leave an ActionScript 3 simply because it's going to give us more options and more features that we can work with. There are times when you will default to an HTML5 canvas, and even things that you make in ActionScript 3 can be exported into an HTML5 canvas. So we're going to start first with ActionScript 3. Then we're going to go ahead and create our document. And you can see it's automatically going to set up the 720p layout here. And you can see this layout might be a little different than what we're used to looking at in Photoshop. We do see some things that might look similar, but again, it's a little different. Now we, of course, can change this view here by just going to our window, and we, of course, have different workspaces that we can work in. And this is just the basic one. If we change it to more of the classic workspace, it's going to move these keyframes right here up to the top of our workspace. There's other views that might also be more helpful to you just by switching through, such as the Essentials workspace, which is, again, very similar. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and you can choose which one of those that you think is going to be most comfortable for you based upon those ones. There's also the Animator workspace, which is going to add in things like colors and stuff like that. But I'm going to go ahead and for now just go ahead and leave this on Essentials just for us to get started. All right, the next thing to look at is including just some of these basic tools over here. All right, the most important one, of course, is your selection tool. And if I right click on that, you can also see there's a sub selection tool, which I'll talk about a little more here in a second. And we also have our free transform tool. And we'll look at all these here in turn, and we'll get to be very familiar with them as we move through the course. The other thing I want to point to is down here is our timeline down here. So here's where we put all our different frames here. We're going to control our animation. And you can see we have a layers panel, which of course we are very familiar with from working with Photoshop. We of course can hide layers. We can we can lock them as well. But if I were to get started here, let's just go ahead and just show something real quick. I'm going to use the rectangle tool. And I'm just going to go ahead and click and draw a rectangle. And all that's going to do is just going to go ahead and add in a rectangle. Pretty self-explanatory. If I right click on this, you can see I have other options. There's primitive tools and stuff in here. And we'll talk about that more as we get into it. But let's just switch to an oval tool for now. And go ahead and draw an oval. And you can see just by clicking and dragging my mouse, I can freely create ovals of different shapes. And one of the cool things is if I go back to that sub selection tool here, All right, I can actually then click on this shape here, and I can grab individual components such as a corner in order to drag these to make shapes that would be not traditional polygons here. All right, so it allows us to very quickly and easily edit those shapes. Additionally, when we start looking at things, if I go back to my selection tool here, all right, we can, of course, select a shape very quickly and easily to move it around. We also have our free transform tool, which is going to give us additional options here, such as being able to rotate our shapes, which is very handy. We can, of course, resize these very quickly on the fly, allowing us to scale and transform our different shapes. One other thing to point out, going back to the sub-selection tool real quick, is if I go ahead and go to a shape and I double click on this shape. So let's say I want my circle here. If I click and drag over this, you can see I get all these different kind of points up here around that shape. And that's kind of nice. I can also click on the edge of a shape to kind of get the same effect. Of course, and like I mentioned before, you can use that to drag and select these. Or if you select that shape, you can, of course, get these anchor points here to show up. And that's how you can quickly come in and start manipulating these different pieces here. So even like a circle I can use to bring out some of these different pieces. I can even change the angle here of some of these so I can get into some really cool and unique shapes here that I might not otherwise be able to manipulate in using something this easily that I could in Photoshop. The other tool we're going to be using is the pen tool. All right, and with the pen tool, it is just kind of like how we did things with kind of, you can think almost in Photoshop, where we could click and make a bunch of points here and we can join them together. We can easily come in here and add new points to a structure, so we can, if we want to manipulate it in different ways, we can do that as well. We of course have the ability to add anchor points or delete anchor points, but again, it's just something real quick and easy for us to work with. I'm just going to go ahead and just leave it as a very basic shape here for now. Now, let's actually go and use these tools to create a very basic animation. So what I'm going to do is just going to go ahead and select everything here and then tap the delete key on my keyboard just to clear out my canvas. And I'm going to go ahead and choose a rectangle tool. And let's just go ahead and just draw that here in the middle of our canvas. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered. Just go ahead and draw that in here. And what I want to do is go ahead and make this into kind of more of a gradient shape. And of course, you can see right now we have a solid shape here. We also have this outline here of the black, which of course is our stroke color. So if we want to put a gradient into this shape, you notice there is not a gradient tool that we have readily accessible to us here. All right, there's no gradient tool option here like there is in Photoshop. We have a paint bucket tool, which is really handy, but we don't have a gradient tool. Now, if I'm on the paint bucket, of course, you can see I do have some options here. I do have a fill option, which if I double click that, it will bring up the option for me to change colors, which is really handy. It might be useful. But what I want to do is actually go to Window, and I'm going to go to Color. And what I'm going to do is in here now I can see the option for solid color, or I have linear or radial gradients. And I'm going to just do a linear gradient for now. And you can see it's going to default to this black and white. And I don't want that. I want maybe something a little bit more dynamic. So I'm just going to, if you hover over your gradient bar here, you can see that the cursor has a plus sign to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit plus here to add a color in. And then what I'm going to do is at that color gradient, I want to go ahead and make sure at this point in time here, if I double click that little anchor, I can choose what color I want that to be. So I'm just going to go ahead and add this blue in here. So it's going to go from a black to more of a blue to more of a white. And that looks like a pretty nice gradient. Now, if I want to apply that to this rectangle that I made previously, making sure that I'm on the paint bucket tool, I can go ahead and click that, and you can see that it's now filled that gradient into that rectangle. Now, let's say I want to take this gradient and make it into a very simple animation. All right, it's very easy for us to be able to do that, and all we're going to do is we're going to go to our timeline here, and let's just say we're going to make it a 1 second animation. So because we are set up as 30 frames per second, that means I need to insert 30 frames. So I'm just going to go to 30 right here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to insert a frame. And all that's going to do right now is for 30 frames, I'm going to have this rectangle. Now I did say earlier that there's not a tool that directly allows us to work with gradients, but there is something that allows us to transform gradients. And so if I go under my free transformation tool, we do have the gradient transform tool option. And what that's going to do is if I click on this shape here, it's going to allow us to either rotate or slide or move around this gradient within this shape bound. And in order for this to become animated, there's going to be something that I'm going to need to do here in my timeline, which is insert what's called a shape tween. Now, we don't have to worry yet about what tweens are, because we'll talk about a little more what they are as we move further to this course. For now, I just want you to go ahead and do what I'm doing here in this animation, which is I'm going to go ahead and right click here on the timeline, and I'm going to choose the option to create a shape tween. And you can see that this is now changed into kind of this dotted outline. And what I want to do is on my shape here, at frame 30, I'm just going to go ahead and go to where I have the rotate tool here at the corner of the shape. And I'm just going to rotate this gradient. And let's just go ahead and rotate, let's say 180 degrees. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and I can rewind this timeline here in such a way that when I press play, you can see right now nothing has happened. That's because right now we're missing an ending here to our shape tween. So let me back this up here. Control Z. And I'm actually just going to insert a keyframe here at the end and then insert my shape tween. And so now when I use my rotation, let's go ahead and put that in and press play. You can see how the animation has changed there. All right, we want this to be a little bit more of a rotating effect. Of course, I can change how this ultimately ends here. I can go and just rotate this shape back. Let's put a little bit more, so a 90-degree rotation. And if I press play, you can see now we have something that's a little bit more nicer there in the transition effect. And so that allows us to very quickly and easily manipulate that. So again, to make this animation, all I did was I created a quick rectangle shape. I applied a gradient to it. I inserted 30 frames of animation. I inserted a keyframe here at the end so it knows this is the stopping point. I put a shape tween on the timeline, and then I just simply went to the end of my timeline here at the new keyframe and rotated that gradient. Now, the last thing, of course, is just to export our animation. Now, this is going to be very similar to how we've done things in Photoshop, but the menu might be a little different. So we're going to go up here to File, and we're going to export this. And you can see we have more options here than what we did in Photoshop. Now, because we want to do a GIF here, we can do an Export Animated GIF. And that, of course, will bring up kind of a familiar menu that we've seen here in Photoshop. So we, of course, have our GIF option right here. We, of course, have options for looping and everything else. But this should be perfectly fine for what we are working with. You go ahead and save this, and you'll be able to have your very first animated GIF here that we made in Adobe Animate.